You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. On the night of June 25, 1950, North Korea made a surprising move by sending 10 divisions, which added up to 89,000 soldiers, into a full-blown attack against South Korea. This massive force, arranged in 6 groups, caught the South Korean military off guard and easily overpowered them. The South's army, which was smaller and lacked both organization and proper equipment, couldn't hold up against the North's onslaught. Despite resistance from South Korea's 38,000 troops stationed at the front line, the North Korean army swiftly advanced southward, even capturing Seoul, the capital of South Korea, by June 28th. This rapid advance forced the South Korean government and the remains of its army to retreat further south. In response to the crisis, the United Nations Security Council decided to step in to help South Korea from falling completely. The United States 7th Fleet, including the powerful fleet carrier USS Valley Forge and Britain's Far East Fleet, with ships like HMS Triumph, were sent to provide air and naval support. They aimed to slow down the North Korean push with a naval blockade and airstrikes, but these efforts weren't enough to halt the North's advance. President Harry S. Truman of the United States saw the need for more direct action and ordered American ground troops to enter the fray. However, the United States military in the Far East wasn't as strong as it once was following the end of World War II, with reduced numbers and outdated equipment. The nearest available unit was the 24th Infantry Division, based in Japan, which was not at full strength and poorly equipped. The leader of this division, Major General William F. Dean, identified the 21st Infantry Regiment as the best prepared group for combat. He chose the 1st Battalion of this regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Bradford Smith, who had significant combat experience from World War II, specifically at the Battle of Guadalcanal, to lead the counter-effort. This battalion was quickly flown into Korea using C-54 Skymaster planes to take a stand against the North Korean forces, buying some time for the rest of the division to arrive by sea. This strategic move aimed to halt the North Korean advancement and protect the South from falling entirely. When you reach Busan, make your way to Daejeon. Our aim is to halt the North Koreans as far from Busan as possible by blocking their main route northward. It's crucial to find General Church, or if he's not available, push on to Daejeon or further if possible. Unfortunately, this is all the information we have at the moment. Wishing you the best of luck, and may God watch over you and your troops. The 24th Infantry Division's first groups departed from Itazuke Air Base in Japan on June 30th. This team, known as Task Force Smith after its leader, Charles Bradford Smith, consisted of 406 individuals from the 1st Battalion, 21st Infantry Regiment, and 134 from a battery, 52nd Field Artillery Battalion, all under Lieutenant Colonel Miller O. Perry's command. These forces were both undersupplied and short on manpower. The 1st Battalion, 21st Infantry, was operating with just 2 infantry companies instead of the usual 3 for a battalion of the U.S. Army, and had only half the required staff in its headquarters company, partial communications squad, and only half of a heavy weapons unit, equipped with dated M9A1 bazooka rocket launchers, 2 75mm recoilless rifles, 2 4.2-inch mortars, and 4 60mm mortars. Their equipment mainly came from the remainder of the undermanned 21st. A battery, providing all the artillery support for the task force, had 6 105mm howitzers. These howitzers were loaded with 1,200 rounds of high-explosive ammunition, which couldn't pierce tank armor. A mere 6 high-explosive anti-tank rounds were distributed to the unit, all given to one howitzer placed ahead of the main artillery position. A battery was also equipped with 4.50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine guns and 4 bazookas. The majority of Task Force Smith soldiers were teenagers with no battle experience and only 8 weeks of basic training. Just a third of the officers had experienced combat in World War II, and only 1 out of every 6 enlisted men had seen combat. Despite this, many signed up for the task force voluntarily. Each soldier was armed with merely 120 rounds of ammunition and 2 days' worth of sea rations. By July 1st, Task Force Smith had completely arrived in South Korea and quickly set up a headquarters in Daejeon. Soon, they began advancing north by rail and road to confront the North Korean army. As the first of several small U.S. units sent into Korea, Task Force Smith was tasked with absorbing the initial impact of the North Koreans' advance and delaying their progress. This was intended to buy time for more U.S. forces to enter Korea. Tasked by 24th Division Commander William F. Dean, Task Force Smith was directed to blockade the North Korean advance along the highway from Suwon, aiming to do so as far from Pusan as achievable. 3 days later, on July 4th, they positioned themselves on 2 hills on either side of the road north of Osan, which is 6 miles south of Suwon and about 25 miles south of Seoul. These hills provided a clear view almost all the way to Suwon, rising 300 feet above the road. The battalion laid out its formation over a mile across these ridges, awaiting the North Korean forces. They arranged the infantry on the 2 hills, with 5 howitzers a mile behind them and the 6th, carrying the special anti-tank shells, set between the infantry and the rest of the artillery. Heavy rain prevented any air support, so Smith and Perry had the artillery battery pre-registered, hoping it would suffice. The heavy machine guns and bazookas from a battery, along with a group of volunteers, were sent forward to strengthen the infantry positions. On the morning of July 5th, at about 7:30, Task Force Smith caught sight of a group of 8 North Korean T-34-85 tanks, belonging to the 107th Tank Regiment of the 105th Armored Division, as they moved southward towards their position. These tanks were part of the North Korean push south from Seoul, chasing after the South Korean forces who were in retreat. By 8:16, Task Force Smith's artillery had taken its first shots at these approaching tanks from a distance of about 2 kilometers or roughly 1.2 miles. Despite landing numerous hits with 105mm howitzer shells, the tanks seemed unbothered by the assault. As the tanks got closer, within 700 meters or about 2,300 feet, the forces used 75mm recoilless rifles and managed to hit the lead tanks. However, these direct hits didn't seem to cause any damage. Although the North Korean tanks fired back, they couldn't pinpoint the American positions, rendering their counterfire ineffective. At a very close range of 15 yards, 2nd Lieutenant Ali Connor used an M9A1 launcher to fire 22 2.36-inch rockets at tanks. Despite several rockets hitting the tanks where their armor was least strong, they didn't penetrate, and the North Korean tanks kept moving, bypassing an American roadblock without slowing down. They likely thought that the roadblock was manned by South Korean troops and therefore didn't consider it a significant threat. When the tanks were crossing a road's crest, a forward howitzer managed to damage the first 2 tanks, setting one on fire. A North Korean soldier emerged from the burning tank, engaged in fire, and killed the first American casualty in the Korean War ground combat, initially but mistakenly identified as Kenneth R. Shadrick. Unfortunately, after using up its special high-explosive anti-tank ammunition, the howitzer had to switch to high-explosive rounds and was subsequently destroyed by another tank. The American forces managed to damage another tank by hitting its tracks with a 105mm shell. Sadly, during these engagements, the communications between the infantry and artillery were disrupted as the tank tracks severed their signal wires, adding to the confusion on the battlefield. Perry, an American, was wounded in an attempt to capture the crew of a disabled tank as the artillery continued to fire at the advancing tanks without much success. Within an hour, a second group of about 25 T-34 tanks approached the task force. This time, the tanks advanced in a less organized manner, either alone or in small groups. Again, the artillery managed to disable 1 tank and damage 3 others. The North Korean tanks were successful in destroying a key howitzer position, inflicting casualties among the infantry and behind their lines. Despite these setbacks, Perry was able to rally many of the deserting artillerymen back to their positions. The failure to stop the tanks raised doubts about the effectiveness of the 2.36-inch bazookas, a problem not unknown from World War II experiences against German tanks. Due to defense budget cuts after the war, the infantry division had not been supplied with the more powerful M20 3.5-inch bazookas and appropriate ammunition that could have been more successful against the Soviet-made tanks. After the last of the tanks had moved past their positions, no North Korean forces were seen again for about an hour. At 11 o'clock, observers noted 3 tanks moving south from the north. Following closely behind was a massive column of trucks, stretching 6 miles long, loaded with 2 infantry regiments, the 16th and the 18th from the North Korean 4th Infantry Division. This formidable force, nearly 5,000 soldiers strong, was under the leadership of Major General Lee Kwan-moo and was moving up from Seoul. Interestingly, this infantry column seemed out of touch with the tanks leading the charge, and the soldiers aboard were unaware of the American forces lying in wait. By 11:45, as this column drew within 1,000 yards of the U.S. positions, Smith gave the command, and the American task force unleashed its full firepower. Mortars, machine guns, artillery, and rifles roared to life, hitting several trucks and throwing the column into disarray. The tanks, however, continued their advance, getting within 300 meters of the Americans and began firing. At the same time, about 1,000 North Korean soldiers tried to circle around to the east, using the rice paddies for cover in an effort to outflank the Americans. But their attempt was thwarted. Smith tried calling in an artillery strike on the North Koreans, but couldn't get his message through, presumably, he thought, because the tanks had taken out the artillery positions. In less than an hour, the North Koreans managed to organize another flanking maneuver to the west, forcing Smith to move one of his platoons for better protection. It was then that the U.S. forces began receiving heavy mortar and artillery fire from the enemy. Task Force Smith found itself in a tough situation, holding their position for 3 hours before running into trouble around 2:30. The commander, Smith, seeing they were low on ammunition and struggling with communication breakdowns, decided it was time to pull back. The North Korean forces were closing in from every direction. To manage their retreat, Smith planned for the units to fall back in turn so they could cover each other during the withdrawal. First, it was Company C, then the medics, followed by headquarters, and Company B was to be the last to retreat. However, a mix-up meant 2nd Platoon from Company B missed the memo. By the time they realized they were left behind, it was too chaotic to organize a proper retreat, leaving behind equipment and, tragically, wounded soldiers and a medic who were later found executed. A North Korean officer even commented to historian John Toland that the American troops seemed too scared to fight. What was meant to be an orderly retreat turned into a messy and panicked escape. The worst losses for Task Force Smith came during this chaos, as they were sitting ducks for enemy fire. The survivors managed to regroup with some artillerymen at Battery A's position. They rendered their howitzers useless to the enemy by removing critical parts and then retreated on foot, eventually making it back to their transport vehicles, which, luckily, were undisturbed and helped them flee further south to regroup with more U.S. forces. By nightfall, 250 members of Task Force Smith had made it back, but around 150 were either dead, wounded, or missing. Over the following days, more stragglers trickled in, including some from 2nd Platoon, Company B, who arrived at Chonan just ahead of the North Korean army. Initially, casualties were reported as 20 dead and 150 others missing or wounded, but these numbers were later corrected to 60 dead, 21 wounded, and 82 captured, with 32 of those captured not surviving captivity. This loss represented 40% of Task Force Smith. American troops would later discover the grim fate of several comrades from the 24th Infantry Division, found in shallow graves, executed. On the other side, the North Koreans suffered 42 dead and 85 wounded, losing 4 tanks but were delayed by about 7 hours in their advance. The Battle of Osan marked the first ground combat involving United States forces during the war. It revealed significant shortcomings in the American military, highlighting that the troops were underprepared and equipped with outdated gear that was ineffective against North Korean armor. Furthermore, the American soldiers' lack of training and experience was stark in comparison to their North Korean adversaries. This imbalance, along with a significant difference in troop numbers, played a crucial role in the outcome of this and subsequent battles. Instances of United States troops leaving their posts too early, abandoning equipment and the wounded, further underscored these weaknesses. One officer, Smith, expressed regret over not retreating sooner, which resulted in North Korean forces surrounding and inflicting heavy losses on his unit. These early setbacks for the United States forces were repeated in the following month as they were consistently pushed back by North Korean advances. Despite facing a tough defeat, the Task Force Smith did manage to delay the North Korean advance for a few hours. This brief resistance allowed other units, like the 24th Infantry Division's 34th Infantry Regiment, to set up defenses further south, although they too would face defeat. Over the following month, these units engaged in multiple actions to slow down the enemy, but with limited success. Eventually, the North Koreans forced the 8th Army to retreat to Pusan, where a critical standoff known as the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter took place, ultimately leading to a turning point in the war with the defeat of North Korean forces in the south. 3 months after the Battle of Osan, a significant counterattack unfolded. United States and United Nations forces, following a strategic surprise landing at Incheon, pushed northward from the south, joining forces with the X Corps, which was advancing from the north. This maneuver effectively squeezed the North Korean army in the south, leading to its defeat. Years following the Korean War, the United States Army honored the locations in Japan where Task Force Smith had trained as a memorial site. Additionally, a monument was erected on the battlefield in Osan, serving as a focal point for annual commemoration ceremonies hosted by the 8th Army, which remains based in South Korea. On the 60th anniversary of the Battle of Osan, 8th Army leaders and Osan government officials held a ceremony celebrating Task Force Smith's valiant effort, describing it as the beginning of a long-standing ideological battle that still resonates today. The 61st anniversary also saw both United States military and Osan officials coming together to remember the sacrifices made by the task. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.